There we go. So we'll review. Palestine comes from the Philistines, the sea people that migrated from the Mediterranean Sea area, maybe the island of Crete. Canaan is the name, representing the Canaanites. The Philistines were primarily military enemies. The Canaanites were primarily cultural enemies. And what I mean by saying that is the Canaanites had a fairly similar priestly structure. They had high priests, they had low priests, they had a sacrificial system. They had many things that were very, very similar to the cultic or the religious behavior, the religious structure of Israel. And because of that, Israelites could be seduced very easily into the Canaanite religion because it was basically, why don't you join our denomination? But the advantage that we have in our denomination is we have temple prostitution and temple immorality. And we've got more gods than you have, and we can cover the bases better. This is the influence of Baal, or Baal, that you see in the Old Testament and even influencing in the New Testament. And then Baal's girlfriend, Ashtarte, or the Ashtaroth. This was the male and the female counterparts for the Canaanite religion. Thirdly, there is the name Israel. And of course, that represents the patriarchal father that was renamed, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. And of course, Israel was the name given, and Israel represents the 12 tribes and their possession of the land. In 1988, when my daughter Joanna was born, while we were in Israel, we had to get a United States passport, we had to get an Israeli birth certificate, and we had to get a Palestinian birth certificate because we had come into the country through Jordan. And so as we passed from quote-unquote territory to territory and the different authorities, you had to be very careful. Was she born in Israel? Was she born in Palestine? If we were to cross the border from Israel into Jordan and say she was born in Israel, we would have maybe sat there for a long, long time. And you had to present the different documents. These names do mean something, and it's loaded with history. So that's why you see even today different names for the land. Of course, the Holy Land was that which represented God's designation over it after the conquest and the possession of the land of Israel, that it was to be holy. It's a designation of something that was separated to God. It's also called the Lord's land, demonstrating or stating God's sovereign rule over it. We see in the Bible it's called my land, and the land of the Philistines. So designations are important, and they basically say who owns it. And so these are the different names that you will see for the land of Israel. Now, the greatest importance of the land of Israel is that it is a land bridge between three continents: Europe, Asia, and Africa. And you can pound an enemy from the air today, or quote unquote from the sea, but you can only possess land on the ground. Even today, with all of our military might, it takes an army to possess the land. And in ancient Near Eastern times, in order to conquer the world, you had to go through Israel. That's what made it such a difficult place to live. It was not a matter of if war would come, but when war would come. And particularly between Africa and between the Syria, Lebanon area, there was constantly armies moving back and forth across. And the most strategic place to defend yourself and the most difficult to break through was always the valley of Megiddo, the valley of Armageddon, It's an area that we'll have a chance, I think, to see on the video. Forces people because of the mountains, because of the sea and the terrain. It always forces armies into that kind of pincer, narrow gap where the biggest war will take place. Once you break through that, then it's a kind of an open run. In the ancient Near Eastern world, it was the land bridge between the two great empires, the ones that came out of Egypt, the pharaohs, the Ptolemies at that time, or the ones that came out of Mesopotamia, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Medo-Persians, as you see in the Old Testament, or prior to the days of Jesus, the Seleucids. It's really, Israel was the place where east met west, north met south, where trade, commerce, and cultures clashed. And so it was very important. As far as the divisions of the land, you have your coastal plain, and the coastal plain area was, and this is where we'll get to our map here. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4 basic coastal plains, and the different boundaries of them. You can look at your map that has the names on it, and that would be your map number 1. The plain of Phoenicia, the plain of Acre, the plain of Sharon, and the plain of Philistia. Coming off of the Mediterranean Sea, as we will see when we look at our east to west and north to south maps, you always have this gradual rise off the water of what is fairly flat land. This is the land that has a combination of marshes, but also of your fertile land, your fertile bread baskets, we would say. And these plains most often are the areas where you can grow the most food. In ancient Near Eastern history, more than today, to possess the land that grows the food was the most important. As far as the plain of Acre, the plain of Acre, you see right at the bottom of it, the little, and I don't have a pen with me, but I'll use this here. You see right here, this here, that is Mount Carmel, or as the little kids like to say, Mount Carmel, like a caramel apple, but Mount Carmel. And Mount Carmel is a high bluff that reaches out into the Mediterranean, and because it's high and because it's to the north, it receives the most rain. Remember, the farther north you are, the more rain you get, the higher the elevation, the more rain you get. This was an area that had lots of trees, lots of fruit trees, and other things on it, and of course, they would gather the rain off of Mount Carmel, and they would channel it down to other cities via aqueducts. The plain of Sharon was a plain that was known for forests and for vegetation. You hear him speak in the Old Testament about the wine of Sharon. Sharon was a great place for the grapes and things like that. The plain of the Philistia, of course, this was down in an area where you had the port of Joppa. And if you could have a port and bring in ships, you would again control a lot of business. The port of Joppa was not a deep port, but it was the best that they had. The only other port was way up here in the Acre area, and that was the Tyre and Sidon. If you could control a port, you could control the shipping. Roads from land would come from the ports and would spread outwardly. The next area that we talk about is the Shephelah. And the Shephelah, and I don't think we need to go into the boundaries as much for the Shephelah, but the Shephelah was rolling hills. And this was the foothills that began to go up to the mountain areas. And the Shephelah was important because of the fact that more of your fruit trees, your olive trees, and things like that could grow there. The Shephelah was a little higher in elevation, so it would get some rain. But it was also kind of a buffer zone. It was an area of forests, and that provided a buffer between the people of Israel and between the enemies of the Philistines. So the question was, how far up were you willing to travel to fight with your enemies? And if you were down below and you were going to have to trek your army up the foothills and everything to fight your enemy, you're going to be more tired than they are. You're also going to be shooting up while they're going to be shooting down. So the Shephelah formed a little bit of a buffer area for the people up in Jerusalem and in the Judea area. So now, as far as some mountain ranges, in the western plateau, you have Galilee, Samaria, Judea, and the Negev. Galilee, the natural boundaries of the Galilee were the fact that it was along a mountain range on the right. You had the Jordan River going down, which was generally a natural barrier. You had mountains coming up on this side. And so the plateau of the Galilee was generally a good and safe place as long as you controlled the high areas. Galilee was a great place because it also had the sea, which produced a lot of fish. And fish is a great source of protein. Fish can be salted down and preserved. And so the region of the Galilee was more or less kind of a blue-collar, hard-working people. Had good roads, lots of influence from the Greco-Roman cities. The farther north you are, the more rain you have. So you had a lot of rain. And they, again, could grow olive trees. It was an area with a lot of volcanic ash, and therefore it was a very fertile area. Even though you didn't have a lot of land, the land was very, very fertile. Israel can have about 10 cuttings a year of wheat in the Galilee area. Probably in the U.S. you get 2. If you have a good year, you might get 3 in some areas. But part of it is because it's all from the years and years of the flooding of the Jordan River. The Jordan River doesn't flood anymore because they take all the water off of it, and they use it for irrigation and for other things. The second area, well, let me put up the other map here. Let's see.
Dr. J, when you talk about the sea, you're talking about those lakes that are part of the Jordan River Valley?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, I'll have to go back, let's see, and think about, when I said sea, I'm sometimes talking about the Mediterranean Sea.
Right, but I didn't think that the Galilee...
No, that's the Sea of Galilee, the fresh water.
Okay.
The main body of fresh water for them. So, just as far as distances, and this is what you for your quizzes, this is kind of a self-study in which you take these quizzes on your own. But the land of Israel is a very, very small area. You're talking, from Mount Carmel over to the edge of the Sea of Galilee, only 25 miles. That would be from, what? What is it from here to Brighton? Probably 20 miles? Maybe? 18 miles?
I'd say
Huh?
I don't know, 20 something.
From here to downtown.
Here to downtown is probably 20 miles. So you're not talking very far at all. It's a small land. The Sea of Galilee is only about 13 to 14 miles long. It's about 6 to 6.5 miles wide. And it's kind of like an oblong bowl. The Sea of Galilee is about 300 feet deep. So it's got good depth. The Sea of Galilee is also about 600 or 700 feet below sea level. So it can be very hot and humid. Number 3, from the south of the Negev all the way up to the north, you're only looking at 145 miles. So that would be from Toledo
Here to Cleveland.
from here to Cleveland. You sure?
Absolutely positive.
Positive. So, from here to Cleveland on the curve. But here again, not so very far. Small country. Number 4, from the bottom of the Sea of Galilee to the top of the Dead Sea, you're looking at 65 miles. And that would be all downhill. It's all a downhill walk, and it's a very flat walk. You would say, for instance, here is Nazareth. Here is the sea of, or the Nazareth and the towns of the Galilee. Up here is Jerusalem, and so you say to yourself, well, why wouldn't they walk right straight from here to here? Why would they go all the way down this way and all the way back up? Is that not the long, hard way? Well, the answer is no. It's actually the shortest way and the easiest way. The reason is when we look at our other map, we'll see that everything here is covered with hills and valleys and mountains, and you're constantly going around and around and around. I don't care if you go around or you go up and down. The longest distance is from here to here on a straight line, unless you are a bird. Here, you have 65 miles of nice, flat, gentle, downhill walk until you get to Jericho. Jericho is an oasis. It was not quite the Las Vegas of the day, because it didn't have the neon lights, but it was the oasis city to visit, with lots of things going on and lots of fruits and vegetables. Jericho was the crossroads for major business routes we're going to see. And so, as you come down, you have this nice gentle walk, and then after the 65 miles down, you have about 18 miles where you go up, and that even is fairly straight. It's winding, but no great big curves, and you would wind your way up to Jerusalem. So it was actually the easiest way and the shortest way. That's probably why God places John the Baptist somewhere in this region here when he is preaching to the people. It's the crossroads of the King's Highway. It's the crossroads of commerce. People coming from Egypt, people coming from south, what we would call today Saudi Arabia, people even coming from Damascus and the Mesopotamian area of what is today Iran and Iraq. They could easily come down, cut across through Jericho, and then go up over to Joppa or one of the other ports. So John the Baptist, although he's quote-unquote in the wilderness and he's off the beaten path, he is still near the main intersection where all the cultures are crossing, all the trade is crossing. So if you want to get your message out, you put yourself in a place where people can access you. I think we see John the Baptist in the desert, not only because it's the prophetic motif, but because it allows him to disassociate from anything else. If he's in Jerusalem, everybody's thinking, oh, he's just another, Jew prophet. If he's in another one of the Greco-Roman cities, he's just another philosopher. Here, he separates himself from everything. He is not down here where the Qumran community is and where the Essenes are. He's up here where there is much water along the Jordan. Number 6, 55. Number 6 is 55. 50 miles is the length of the Dead Sea. Not today anymore, because they continue to draw off so much water. The Dead Sea is shrinking, but it is a natural barrier again from one's enemy. Below the Dead Sea in ancient Near Eastern times was all very, very marshy, and so it was difficult to cross, and then you were left with the desert with the desert and mountains and no access for fresh water or anything. Difficult to move an army across there. So armies always crossed up where Jericho was. That's, of course, where Joshua went through too. You've only got 55 miles from here to here, from where it would be Joppa into the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea is about 12 or 1,300 feet below sea level, and it's about 12 or 1,300 feet deep. They have drilled in the area of the Dead Sea, and they have gone down as much as, I think, 3 miles, and all they have found in the cores is more silt and more junk. So it's the only place on Earth where a plane can fly below sea level. It's part of the Syrian-African rift, a rift that goes over 4,000 miles in our Earth. They're having problems with the Dead Sea shrinking. One of the things they've talked about, it would be very expensive, is to build an aqueduct from the Mediterranean into the Dead Sea area and just flood it with Mediterranean water, because this is 12 to 1,300 feet below sea level. Another thing they've talked about is to make an aqueduct from the Red Sea, which is down here, and bring it back up to the Dead Sea, although they don't have as much elevation. But in the days of Jesus, it was a natural border. That's why when you hear people fleeing from Jerusalem up here, they got to come down from the mountains. They either have to cross here at Jericho, or they have to come down and cross below the Dead Sea to where the city of Petra or the Edomites are. You remember the prophet Obadiah, he rebukes the Edomites for butchering their cousins, the Jews. And what they did was, when the people were fleeing from Jerusalem to come down here, of course they come down through this exhausting mountains where it's all desolate, where there's no food, there's no water. They get down to here, they're absolutely weak and exhausted, and then they stand there and butcher them at the crossroads where they would then cross over and try to go on to Egypt. Yes?
I was just going to ask, what's happening with the Dead Sea now, and why is it important that they try to replenish the water?
Because it's a natural border between Jordan and Israel, and because terrorists try to infiltrate into Israel through Jordan.
Okay.
And so if it's filled with water, it is a much better barrier.
So it's not a natural disaster this way, and it happened. It's more of a sociological, we're trying to build boundaries between countries.
It was a natural boundary that is drying out.
Right, but it's not like if we lose it, the land is crumbling.
No. In fact, they're mining the land. Both the Jordanians and the Israelis have thousands of people that mine all of the chemicals and that are in the Dead Sea water bed. So, yes.
Is the Sea of Galilee fresh water or salt water?
The Sea of Galilee is totally fresh water. It's fed by the Jordan River. We'll look at the 4 sources to the Jordan River, and they are fed off of Mount Hermon that has snow on it. But the Sea of Galilee is down several dozen feet in depth due to the fact of there's been a little bit of dry weather over the last decade or so. But more than that, they continue to drain so much water off of it for irrigation, for the cities, for the people of Israel and Palestine, that the water isn't getting into the Sea of Galilee. They've got a huge national aqueduct that picks the water up from the Jordan River before it gets to the Sea of Galilee. And draining that all off is diminishing the Sea of Galilee. So, again, from the bottom of the Dead Sea down to the Red Sea, which is where Egypt begins, is only 115 miles. So you can get a sense that the land is fairly small. The region of Samaria is a region where it is very, very hilly, very, very mountainous. And it was the center, of course, of the Samaritans. When the kingdom divided into the 10 northern tribes and the 2 southern tribes, Samaria was the center of idolatry, as well as up in Tel Dan, which was way up in the northern Galilee. Then you have Judea, and when we look at the trade routes of Judea, we're going to see that Judea was very dependent upon the spiritual climate of the people. Jerusalem was not on any of the major trade routes. It was only on the religious pilgrimage trade route. There was no reason to go to Jerusalem except for spiritual pilgrimage or patronage. And so the city was very dependent upon the good health of the people, the good spiritual health. The Negev, which is way down here, in Hebrew the word Negev means south. The Negev was a little more than desert. It's a great desert expanse between Israel and Egypt. Let's see, we mentioned the Jordan Rift being some 4,000 miles long. On the well, we'll see it when we look at the cross view. So, as far as the Transjordan Valley, there were very natural boundaries to the Transjordan Valley. Let me get a couple of more maps out here so we can illustrate this. So, here's just the big picture for everything. You can see Jordan, Saudi Arabia down here. This is the area of Mesopotamia where you don't get anywhere unless you go through the land of Israel. Here is your east to west and south to north. So I'm going to just get my little pointer. There we go. So here you see the plains. These are the plains of Philistia, of Sharon, of Ager, and of Phoenicia. Nice and flat, coming off of the Mediterranean. Here is Jaffa. Then you go into the Shephelah, the nice rolling hills, lots of forest. Then from there you take a big climb up to the mountains that are in the center of Judea, of Samaria, and of Galilee. Then look at the drop, back down the other side, and of course this is the Jordan Valley, the African-Syrian Rift, 1,300 feet below sea level. But then you go up, 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 and this is over a mile higher than these mountains, the top of Jerusalem. Right about this area here is the modern city of Amman, Jordan, and they have a hotel there. I think it's the King Hussein Hilton. That I don't know if it's still named that, but it's about 12, 13, 14 stories. And late at night, you can go up to the top, and on one of the top rooms or on the roof, on a clear day, you can look over and you can see the lights of Jerusalem. It's that much higher. So this is what we're looking at. Well, if you're down here and you're living in the plains in the bread basket and you control all the food, well then you're not going to bother the people up here unless they bother you. But these people up here often, in order to get food, have to come down and try to take possession of the land. And that's why you constantly see the fighting going back and forth between the peoples of the mountains and the peoples of the valley because of the need for food.
Can I ask you a question?
Yep.
In Isaiah 19, it talks about in that day there will be a highway from Egypt to Assyria.
Yes. Well, but when you say where is it?
Yeah.
We're gonna,
Never happened yet, right?
well, there is a highway, and there's an ancient highway, and there will be a modern highway, and there is a modern highway today, and it's called the ancient highway is called the King's Highway, and I think it still has the name King's associated with it. That goes from Egypt all the way. Remember that Jordan has been the big commercial partner or supplier for Iraq, for Iran, and for everything that goes over land, even from Saudi Arabia. So we'll look at some of those.
So then that still has to happen then. It has to be that highway, or that highway is coming between Assyria, Israel, and Egypt.
That highway exists. Whether it's the fulfillment of Isaiah, yet probably not. But the road exists. There's a lot of commerce that goes on between Egypt, Israel, and Jordan, and then up to the area of Iran and Iraq, and that. It's interesting that because of security, the trucks have no hoods on the engines. They have no flaps hardly on the truck beds. They have no enclosures like we have for our trucks. Everything is wide open so that nothing can be hit. And when they come through inspection, you got an engine, you got a driver's seat, and you got a bunch of boards, and everything else is very, very transparent. So, now, looking at this next section, this is going from the south, or Hebron, all the way up to Mount Hermon. Mount Hermon, 9,200 feet above sea level. This is where you have snow. This is where the greatest source of water comes, down to 4 tributaries that form the Jordan River. The Jordan River comes down and forms the Sea of Galilee and this area, and then from the Sea of Galilee it goes all the way down to the Dead Sea. Here you can see the Sea of Galilee. So there's a great border between the mountains of Galilee, Samaria, and Judea, and on the other side, the Mediterranean Sea. Now, in for instance, the weather conditions, air that comes off of water is usually cooler, correct? Cooler water, cooler air. And so when you have the cooler air coming off of the Mediterranean Sea, And then it comes up and it catches the mountains, which can make it even cooler. And then it comes and it drops down to the area of the Sea of Galilee. So we're going here from a couple thousand feet above sea level, all of a sudden to 600 feet below sea level. And the lower you go, usually the hotter the air, the more humid and dense the air. What you have is cold air hitting warm air, clashing. Then as this air gets forced up to the other side, all right, here we are, as this air gets forced down and the hot air comes up and hits the cold again, you get sudden storms, sudden wind and weather changes. And that's why you find that the Sea of Galilee is a place where you do have sudden storms and very, very violent storms. I've been on the Sea of Galilee. Excuse me, when we have 8 and 12 and 15-foot waves. Now, for a sea that's only 13 miles long and 6 miles wide, that's quite a bit. The other thing that they love on the Sea of Galilee is, let's see, we'll go up here. Because this wind is constantly, most often coming out of the north and coming this direction, and then it swoops down the valley, you find windsurfers out there most every day of the year when it's warm enough, because you constantly have this wind current taking you down the side. So here again, if we were to go out here to the area of Mount Carmel, you remember that when Elijah tells his servant to look for the cloud, he actually tells him to look out this way for the cloud, which was the unusual thing. The cloud came in from the exact opposite natural direction. Clouds and weather always move from the north and the west to the south and the east. The cloud that came and brought the rain and all of the drenching upon Mount Carmel actually came from the south and from the east, which was a God showing that, hey, this is a special miracle. This was something very unusual. So you can see, looking at this here, if Jesus is up here in the mountains of Nazareth and he wants to go to Jerusalem, the natural walk is not going to be across all these mountains, all of these hills, and everything. That's why when you come to the woman at the well, it says that Jesus did what? Pardon me? He passed through Samaria. He needed to pass through Samaria. You didn't go through Samaria not only because they were unfriendly, and it'd be like a Greek traveling through Italy, or an Italian traveling through Greece. I mean, or a Korean traveling through China, or a Chinaman. They were natural enemies. But also, it just was not the smartest way, the easiest way to travel. You came down to the Jordan Valley. You had this wonderful, nice, slow travel down to the Jericho area. You could stop. You could get refreshed. You could have all kinds of fruits. They had some of the best buffets. And then you would make your way up to Jerusalem and be there for the harvest, or any kind of the festivals or feasts that they would have. So let's just see. Let's talk just a little bit about mountains. Maybe. Let me see what I can say. Mount Hermon. Mount Hermon is 9,000, about 300 feet above sea level. It's snow-capped most of the year. They do have skiing up there. From the Dead Sea to Mount Hermon is only 120 miles. Now, Mount Hermon is probably the region of the Transfiguration of Jesus. When you go to Israel, they will have Mount Tabor. Mount Tabor is the traditional place, but it is probably not the best place. You remember that when after Peter makes his confession, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God," and Jesus says, "Flesh and blood hath not revealed this to you," it's a few days after that he is transfigured on an exceedingly high and bright mountain, and that represents Mount Hermon. Mount Carmel rises about 1,730 feet above sea level, and it sticks out into the sea. This is the place where Elijah and the prophets of Baal had it out. Anytime you read in the Old Testament about that there's no rain at Carmel, if there's no rain at Carmel, there's no rain anywhere. It's in the north, it's high. If it doesn't get the rain, nobody does. In the days of Herod, we find that they would build, and we'll probably see some pictures, they would build some aqueducts to draw all the water that they could off of Mount Carmel, and then to carry it down to the city of Caesarea Maritime. Mount Tabor, and that's supposed to be Tabor. Tabor in Hebrew represented a pregnant woman, or for a man it would be like a beer belly. But it was a word which represented a plumped belly, let's say. And Mount Tabor is about 1,850 feet above sea level. Here again, you can see how with these kinds of areas, is that correct still? No, flipped over. You can see how if you've got this plain coming up in this Shephelah area and these mountains, then it forces armies to cross along the plain or the Shephelah. When you see from the other end, armies coming from the north, they have this small gap where they can cross here because Tabor, Gilboa, Gerizim, and Ebal, and all of these force you to either go on one side of it or the other with your army. And they don't come down into the Jordan Valley because it's all too small. So they're always trapped between the mountains and the plains in this smaller Shephelah area in order to move about. Mount Gilboa is the pass between the Jezreel Valley and the Jordan Valley. It's a small area. Mount Gilboa is about 1,700 feet below sea level, and it's just south of the Sea of Galilee, and it allows a small area where people can pass on their travel routes. Mount Ebal and Gerizim. Ebal is almost 3,100 feet above sea level. Gerizim is only about 2,900 feet above sea level. This is where the blessings and the cursings took place. It's also where the place where Shechem was set up for the idolatrous worship. If you want the gods to hear your prayers, you get up as high as you can. That was their mindset. The higher I am, the better or easier it will be for the gods to hear me and to see me. And so places of idolatry were always set up on the highest areas. Mount Gilead. Mount Gilead is about 3,700 feet above sea level. Mount Gilead was a place where you could oversee the Jordan Valley, the Sea of Galilee, and you could watch for any movement on the part of your enemies. course, Mount Nebo is famous for the place where Moses would looked out into the Promised Land. Mount Nebo is about 2,700 feet above sea level. Jerusalem, we'll talk about that in detail later, and the horns of Hattim aren't important to us. That's where Suleiman the Magnificent defeated the Crusaders to take over the land of Israel again. So, lakes and seas. In modern day Israel, you won't find a lake Hula, but in ancient Near Eastern times, there was a small lake, Lake Hula, and it was above the Sea of Galilee. Let's put this up there. This was Lake Hula. It was a small, only about a mile long at most and a mile wide, but it was part of a very, very fertile soil. In modern day Israel has drained it all. Drained all the marshes because they wanted to convert it into tillable soil. The largest hula ever was maybe about 4 miles long and about 1.5 miles wide, but it shrunk and shrunk as they took more and more water off of it. It was only about 15 feet deep, ever. The Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias, or also called Lake Gennesaret or Lake Kinneret, the Greek pronunciation, Sea Chennerith by the Philistines. The word means harp. And if you get a chance to see the Sea of Galilee, it looks very much like a harp. 13 miles long, maybe 6.5 miles wide, 700 feet below sea level, and several hundred feet deep. Lots and lots of different kinds of fish in there. The Dead Sea, over 50 miles long. The widest was about 11 or 12 miles and 1,300 feet below sea level. About 7 million gallons of water flow into the Dead Sea each day, but none of it comes out by any natural source, in the sense of going off into another river. You have about that equal amount of gallons that evaporate every day. So, in the summertime, you're looking at 105, 110, pretty hot.
Dr. Frank?
Yes?
And what's the source of the Dead Sea?
The only source is the Jordan River pouring into the Dead Sea. So, as far as the Mediterranean, the Mediterranean is anywhere from 600 to 1,000 miles from north to south, and it's about 2,200 miles east to west. The Mediterranean Sea is pretty deep. You can get down about 2.5 to 3 miles deep on the Mediterranean. Great source for shipping and trade and access to the rest of the world. The Red Sea, about 1,500 miles long, and 180 miles wide. And the two major gulfs of the Red Sea are the Gulf of Suez and the Gulf of Aqaba. And we have lots of military ships in both of those. Let's see, 5 more minutes, and then we'll take a break. As far as rivers in the land of Jordan, let me see where get an overhead here. Rivers are very important because rivers are a source of water. Where there is water, there is civilization, and civilization can grow. Here is the Jordan River, and it's really the life of the land. The word Jordan means to go down, and probably the Jordan River got its name because it was constantly in elevation going down or descending. There are 4 sources of the Jordan River. They all come from Mount Hermon, pretty much. You don't have to know the names, but it's the Banias, the Liddon, the Hashbani, and the Bear Gate. When we go to Israel, we'll have a chance to see some of these. They are like gushing streams that just flow into the Jordan River.
Are we going to Mount Hermon?
We can't go all the way to Mount Hermon, but we'll see it. We'll be at the foothills of Mount Hermon, where Caesarea Philippi is, where Herod Philip had his kingdom. The Jordan River is anywhere from 30 feet wide to 100 feet wide, depending on what time of the year and depending on the overflowing. When it floods its banks, it can get up to about 200 feet wide, but it doesn't flood its banks so much anymore, just because they're drawing all of the water off of it. It's only about 6 to 12 feet deep. As far as its length, it's only 65 miles from the bottom of the Sea of Galilee to the top of the Dead Sea, but the Jordan River will travel over 200 miles in that 65 miles. For every mile it goes north and south, it goes 3 miles, 2.5 to 3 miles east and west. So there's a lot of winding going on. That's why when it talks about John the Baptist baptizing in an area where there was much water, the natural place would be along the sea, along the Jordan River. Why did he need much water? Because he's doing a lot of sprinkling? Because he was doing a lot of wiping? Or because he was doing a lot of dunking?
Dunking.
Probably because he was doing a lot of dunking. So there are major rivers in the area of Israel. Of course, the Tigris and Euphrates are way over around Iran and Iraq, and you hear about them today, the Tigris and Euphrates, all the bridges that they have across that. The Nile River, which of course is in Egypt, and from that today we've also built the Suez Canal and other things. The important ones to us are the Jabbok, the Kishon, and the Yarmuk. The Yarmuk is this river right here. And the Yarmuk comes down through a cavern. The cliff areas, you got mountains on this side, you got mountains on this side. And very steep, the Yarmuk, and it was the natural boundary. When you look at how the tribes divided up the land, you got Bashan, you got Gilead, and this was the natural boundary. Just like the Mississippi, the Missouri, the Ohio, the Colorado are natural boundaries for us in the United States. The Yarmuk was the natural boundary for divisions of land back then. The Jabbok was this one here. The Jabbok, again, was a natural boundary between the different areas and the tribes, like of Manasseh and others, when they divided up the land. And then Kishon, this is the Kishon. Here, again, coming off of Mount Carmel, it would have had these streams of water, which would have filled up these breadbasket areas. And so those are the main rivers. That's why you find Elisha hiding out along the Kishon, because it would have been an area of vegetation, even though there might not have been much. It would have been a place that you could hide. Pretty hard to hide in the desert. They could see you for miles. But when you have some vegetation, and we'll see some examples of that, you do have areas where you can hide. As far as rainfall and temperature of the land, temperatures in let's say February, because that's when we'll be going. February, generally, you're looking at 45 as a low in the mountains and 75 or 80 in the Dead Sea area. In July or so, you'll be looking at lows of, in the mountains in the evenings it gets nice, like around 65 to 68. Cools off very nicely. But down around the Dead Sea, you'll be looking at 100. Rainfall is most in the north, least in the south. The number of days of rain, in the Sea of Galilee area, you'll have like 60 to 70 days a year where you'll get some rain. Jerusalem in the mountains, maybe 50 to 60. Down in the Negev, maybe 10. From 0 to 10. Most of the land of Israel is watered by a heavy dew. About half the year, you will find when you go out in the morning a very, very heavy dew. The reason is the moisture is coming off of the Mediterranean Sea. It comes up to the mountains. It reaches the cooler mountains and begins to drop its water on the rocks. The rocks are very important because the rocks trap the moisture. You know, the water forms on the rock. It condenses and rolls down underneath the rock, and the rocks hold in all the moisture. So rocks are very important to Israel. As far as the former and latter rains, the former rains are usually those of like October, November, and the latter rains, which are the heaviest, are usually December and January. I've been in Jerusalem in December when I had 65 degrees, bright and sunny. I've been in Jerusalem in December when I had 2 feet of snow. So it doesn't last long, but it's fun while it's there. Israel, the state of Israel, has been underneath a very, very aggressive reforestation program. When you read the Old Testament, you read about it coming into a land of forests and everything, and that's the way the land was. It was during the period of the Ottoman Turks, and during a lot of the wars, they cut down trees, both to punish people, as well as to use them for embattlements and for siege ramps and all those kinds of things. In 1950s, Israel started a very aggressive reforestation. They have planted literally millions of trees, and they have already noticed over the decades that there is a cooling of the climate, there is an increase in the rainfall, and they're getting the climate conditions back to a far more favorable time. As far as the winds of Israel, most of the winds come from the north and the west, down to the south and the east. But they do have what we know as shirakos. They call them hamsings. The word hamsing means hot. This is when it comes off from the south, from the Syrian desert, and it can come up blasting at 110, 115 degrees with 30, 40, 50 mile an hour winds. You remember James talks about the flowering grass that is impacted by the hot winds. It dries up in a day and it dies and blows away. This is a common phenomenon. I remember taking a bus load. We were going from Israel over to Egypt, and we were going to go down through the Sinai and through the Gebel Musa, or Mount Sinai, where traditionally they say Moses was. It's not the right site, but it's a great climb, where St. Catherine's Monastery was, and I was standing outside waiting for the border guards, to let us cross. And there was a Ham Singh or Shirako coming in, and I mean, it was just, felt like you were in a blasting furnace with that high heat and wind and the sand hitting you. And they invited me in to bring all the documents into the trailer where they were staying. It was like a mobile trailer, but had air conditioning and everything. And I walked in there, and in about 5 minutes, you'd have thought I'd wet my pants or taken a shower. I was just drenched with sweat. And the reason is outside I was sweating, but it was drying so quick that you didn't notice it. As soon as I went into this cold air, of course my body was still pouring out the perspiration, but there was nothing to take it away. So, but believe me, I stepped outside a minute later, I was dry. So they have these burning, hot winds. So.
They didn't think you looked really nervous then, huh? They weren't suspicious?
No, they were used to people sweating, so